Again, thank you so much for tuning in to what is the final lecture in lesson 4-1. And I realize that 4-1 has been a long haul, so I appreciate you sticking with me. My name is Professor Jared Rathel, and the title of my presentation for you here is The Angiosperms, Diversity and Structure. I'm going to keep this one short, I promise. We're going to talk about the two major lineages of angiosperms, the monocots and the dicots, and the structures that define them. So really beautiful artwork on the left, but it illustrates what we talked about in Unit 3, the evolutionary history of life on planet Earth, and we talked about the colonization of land by land plants. So here we've got this unicellular green algae that ends up working cooperatively like volvox. Here's our charophytes, right? Our green algae living in the sea. They colonized terra firma some 500 million years ago. We've got our bryophytes here. Here's our ferns, our gymnosperms, and we're going to head right down here to the most evolutionary derived lineage of plants, the angiosperms, the flowering plants. And specifically, we're going to look at two very important lineages of angiosperms. The divergence in the angiosperms occurs right here about 160 million years ago and gives rise to the lineage that we now call the monocots. And then in this direction, we give rise to what they're calling the eudicots or the true dicots. I'm just going to use the old school term dicot. But without further ado, let's learn about the monocots and the dicots. We'll start with the Monocotyledonae. There's some 80,000 species of monocots. I'll give you a quick tour of the diversity in just a second. The Monocotyledonae are named because they have mono, one, cotyledon. Cotyledon is a seed leaf. It's the first little leaf that emerges when the seed germinates. And I'll show you some pictures of each of these structures here momentarily. Monocots are characterized by parallel leaf venation, flower parts that are arranged in multiples of 3, and vascular bundles that are scattered throughout the stem. Okay, so some monocots. The Orchidaceae, we talked about this incredibly successful lineage of plants, some 28,000 orchids. The lilies, springtime, always a beautiful flower. The tulips, you're going to learn about the tulip in Michael Pollan's The Botany of Desire, which is a movie you're going to watch for me this week. The grasses, all of the grasses are monocots, including our grain crops, our cereal grains, which are really just grasses that we've selected for really large seed heads, like you see here in the corn. So corn, rice, wheat, all of our grain crops are monocots. They're modified grasses. Okay, the Dicotyledonae has about twice as many species, about 180,000 species, and they're characterized and named for having two cotyledons, two seed leaves. And I know that seems like a silly characteristic to really like hyper focus on, but those cotyledonae are really, really important in determining this ancient divergence and these two very important lineages. So this is really a paramount characteristic. Further, the dicots have net-like leaf venation. Their flower parts are not arranged in multiples of 3, but multiples of 4 or 5. And then their vascular bundles are arranged in a nice, neat ring when you take a cross-section of the stem. And I'll show you what those structures look like in just a second. But the dicots include the Asteraceae, the sunflower family, with those beautiful composite inflorescence flowers. The dicots include all of our flowering shrubs, like the beautiful bougainvillea that we have that light up our yards. Interesting thing about the bougainvillea, if you look closely, there's the flower. These are actually modified sepals. All of our trees are dicots, as well as the Cactaceae, all dicots. And while the grain crops, corn, rice, wheat, those are grasses, our fruits and veggies, from watermelon to zucchini to tomatoes, these are dicots. Okay, so in your notes, this is a really important part of your notes that you want to fill out. You'll see this table, and these characteristics are left blank for you to fill in. So we're going to start with the namesake, the cotyledons. The cotyledon is the seed leaf that first emerges when the seed germinates. The monocots are named because they have one cotyledon, whereas the dicots, di means two, they have two cotyledons. And again, you see this term dicots, it just means the true dicots. Here's some pictures of some cotyledons. The monocots, just one seed leaf, and then the dicots down here on the bottom right with two seed leaves when the plant germinates. So the top clearly a grass, the bottom, maybe a bean that you grew in a cup in a window. The monocots are going to have parallel leaf venation, whereas the dicots are going to have net-like leaf venation. Seen here, we got a tulip or a lily on the left-hand side, and then a beautiful maple tree on the right. The vascular tissues looks different under magnification. So when you take a cross-section of a monocot stem, those little vascular bundles that contain the xylem and the phloem are going to be scattered throughout the stem. Whereas the dicot is going to have a ring, a nice neat ring of vascular bundles. Here's what I mean. Here's the monocot on the left. So these, what look like little monkey faces under magnification with two eyes and an open mouth, that's the xylem and the phloem. These collectively, we call it the vascular bundle, and you can see they're randomly spread throughout the stem. Whereas the dicot, you think about celery, right? That's split and soaking up food coloring. It's going to run up those vascular bundles that are arranged neatly in a ring in the dicot stem. We talked about root systems in the last lecture. Grasses, monocots, like you see on the left, have a fibrous root system, whereas dicots, like the dandelion, which is in the sunflower family, it has a taproot. And finally, the floral parts. So on the left, the monocot is going to have floral parts in multiples of 3, whereas the dicot on the right is going to have flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5. And by flower parts, I'm talking about the stamen, the male parts, and then typically the lobes on the stigma. The top of the carpel of the female part. And to remind you about your flower parts, so remember the stamen here, this is the male part, okay? And so this is a monocot flower because look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamen. Parts and multiples of 3, meaning 3, 6, 9 is a monocot. And then here's what I mean. This is the stigma here, the sticky stigma, which is the top of the carpel. And you can see that it's got 1, 2, 3 lobes. So flower parts in multiples of 3, a monocot, and multiples of 4 or 5, a dicot. And here's some real flowers. So on the left, we have a monocot, and you can see that it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamen, 6 boy parts, and then 3 lobes on its stigma. Over here, this is the stigma, the red fluffy looking things. That's actually the stigma on a hibiscus. Hibiscus is a flowering shrub. It's a dicot. And look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Parts and multiples of 4 or 5 is a dicot. Okay, so the characteristics between monocots and dicots do show up on your next assessment, so make sure you've completed that table and review my notes if you have any questions. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something.